2 weeks ago, I spoke about existentialism. Today, I speak about capital punishment. I promise, 2 weeks from now, I'm going to speak about membership, and I think that's a good thing. But I do think it's important that I speak about capital punishment, in part because it's on the docket of a number of state legislatures around the country, including my home state of Maryland and where I grew up. Connecticut just passed it, and Pennsylvania's in the process of considering it. I'm going to argue today that I think the death penalty should end in Pennsylvania and the nation and the world. It's expensive, probably ineffective as a deterrent, racially biased. It's cruel, unusual, and it violates the standards of ethical humanism. The most fundamental value is the unconditional worth of every individual. I can't offer detailed arguments for all pieces of this, but I urge you to go and read about it yourself, research it, especially if you disagree with me. And then let's talk. If you agree with me, I urge you to get involved in supporting and sharing resources like Amnesty International and Pennsylvanians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. Come to an event created by them as well as the Mural Arts Program in Philadelphia and other groups here on June 1st called Execute Art, Not People. It will be in the late afternoon and evening. The Pennsylvania Assembly recently postponed a decision on outlawing capital punishment instead by passing Senate Resolution number 6, which was to study capital punishment, to study this horrible process. I think we need to end it permanently. There are few issues about which I'm so passionate or so sure. And that's because that even if capital punishment was pretty inexpensive, an effective deterrent, and racially neutral, I would still oppose it as barbaric. In a nation that prides itself for its honoring of human rights, I think capital punishment is the most egregious violation of those rights. It's been 35 years since the United States reinstated capital punishment. In 1976, the Supreme Court in Gregg v. Georgia said that the state had sufficiently reduced the problem of arbitrary and capricious imposition of the death penalty. The door was open for the states to start killing people again. According to Human Rights Watch, since that time, 1,271 people have been electrocuted, shot, gassed, hung, or put to death by lethal injection. That's a lot of people. 2/3 of all nations in the world, exactly 141, have outlawed this practice. The top 5 nations leading in executions are China, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. The United States is the only country in the Western Hemisphere to execute its own citizens, and the only one in the G8 nations. If the United States was to apply for membership in the European Union, they'd be turned down because of this. Around the world, people see this as destructive of human dignity and a violation of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. So I'm going to run through some of the arguments briefly and then get to the main one that I want to make. First, it's expensive. I thought everybody knew this. While this is less of an ethically important discussion, given our budget, it may be a politically powerful one. The New York Times editorial from last month said that state governments are complaining about the costs with capital punishment. California, for example, spent, get this, $4 billion to prosecute and carry out 13 executions. That's $300 million per cadaver. Most of it's for litigation, of course. On average, it costs $700,000 to keep a person in prison for life, but $2.5 million to execute them. Second, many argue that it's not an effective deterrent. I grew up assuming that from everything I've heard. Because for deterrence to work, it has to affect the mind of the potential perpetrator. For decades, people have been saying that it does not enter the mind of most murderers. Professor Jack Greenberg wrote in the Harvard Law Review, most killers do not engage in a cost-benefit analysis. They are impulsive and they kill impulsively. Recently, Sister Helen Prejean, the author of the book Dead Man Walking, observed, for 30 years we've been putting people to death, and the first thing we've learned is that it deters nothing. It doesn't deter violence. The death penalty states have roughly double the homicide rates as states with it. States without it. Philadelphia's own Michael Cord, who spoke here a couple of months ago, pointedly asked, why is it that in the South, which has the highest murder rate in the country, also has the most death penalty executions, 80% of them, whereas the Northeast, which has the lowest murder rate, has only 1% of the executions? And why do nearly 90% of past and current presidents of the country's leading criminal law academic societies agree that it's not a deterrent? Now, not all agree about this. Recently, I read a new study by the National Research Council of the National Academies that concluded that the studies about deterrence are fundamentally flawed. But certainly, deterrence is not proven. Now, more damning than expense and lack of deterrence is the fact that despite attempted reforms in the early 1970s, we execute people who are innocent. In 1994, Justice Harry Blackmun said, 20 years have passed since the court declared that the death penalty must be imposed fairly and with reasonable consistency, or not at all. And despite the efforts of states and courts to devise legal formulas and procedural rules to meet this challenge, the death penalty remains fraught with arbitrariness, discrimination, and mistake. Justice Blackmun. This must have been felt clearly by Anthony Graves, somebody who was recently freed from death row. He said, I know how easy it was for them to take my freedom and set out to kill me. I feel that if it was that easy, I'm sure that there have been many mistakes in the past, that many men and women on death row are innocent. It's not an infallible system. Human Rights Watch point out that since 1973, more than 130 innocent people, including 6 here in Pennsylvania, were sentenced to death, only to be saved thanks to the zealous and persistent effort of the defense attorneys who filed motion after motion. And now, thank goodness, DNA evidence is overturning more and more death sentences. But it does send chills down my spine to wonder for how many innocent people was the last thought in their mind, but I am innocent. Chills turn to disgust when I realize how many people we've executed who are not fully responsible for our actions. There are some progress in this regard, but people who are mentally challenged or minors, for example, Roper v. Simmons in 2005 outlawed all executions for crimes committed while under the age of 18. But prior to that, between 1985 and 2003, 22 people were executed for crimes they committed when they were 17. That's my son's age. He's very young. Second, those with severe mental disabilities were not safe from execution until a decade ago. In 2002, the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional to execute a mentally challenged person because it offended, quote, evolving standards of decency. That was only 10 years ago. That proves to me evolution is slow. Another powerful argument related to this is that capital punishment is applied arbitrarily. That was the basis for the 1972 Furman v. Georgia decision, by the way, in which the court said that the randomness of being executed is like, quote, being struck by lightning. That's the words they used. It's the same in state after state, despite attempted reforms. In my home state of Maryland, they recently had a new reform law, and some of the state's top attorneys said that this, in fact, only increased the arbitrariness of the death penalty. And it runs from the beginning of the end to the process. The arbitrariness begins with what crimes to investigate, who to target, who to arrest, who to bring to trial, who to sentence, and who to execute. At each step of the way, there's an arbitrariness that's involved. So for me, the clearest argument against the death penalty is factors independent of guilt and innocence are determinant. For example, if you are poor, black, and live in the South, you're more likely to face execution. Whether you live or die should not be determined by the size of your bank account, the color of your skin, or the location of your home. But it does. The poor are most likely to be executed. They're not able to hire the best lawyers that money can buy, so they don't do them justice. And this is only getting worse as states are slashing resources supporting public defenders who are underpaid and overworked. The New York Times said, the problem of inadequate counsel permeates many indigent defendants. This permeates a system with many indigent defendants sentenced to death after major blunders by court-assigned lawyers. Just on April 5th in the Philadelphia Inquirer, Mark Bookman, a former public defender, illustrated this with a story that I want to share. He said, a young man was sentenced to death after proceedings that were often reminiscent of a routine felony case. The man sentenced to death was represented by court-appointed lawyers who have represented scores of other indigent defendants. They were paid an absurdly small amount to defend him in the face of the ultimate punishment. What did the money buy? A review of the court documents doesn't take long. There isn't a single motion filed by the attorneys in defense of their client. Nor is there a request for a jury questionnaire, which is standard in most jurisdictions that regularly handle capital cases, or for a mitigation specialist to prepare a case against the death penalty. Indeed, the only motion in the record was handwritten by the defendant. Prison logs indicate that his lawyers visited him a total of 3 times. Jury selection took only 2 days, partly because the defense didn't ask prospective jurors a single question about the death penalty. In Texas, which executes more convicts than any other state, the average jury selection takes a month. The defendant's guilt was established in 3 days. At the sentencing presentation, the defense's chance to persuade the jury to sentence the man to life without the possibility of parole instead of death, a series of relatives spoke briefly. A psychologist was called as an expert witness for the defense and said that one mitigating factor was the defendant had a drug problem that he hadn't gotten over. When asked whether he would like to mention any other mitigating factors in defense of the man, the psychologist said, no, I would not. And this is despite the fact that there are, in the record, this man was passed from parent to parent to relative because his parents had substance abuse problems while he was a child. The defense's closing argument was very brief. The attorney agreed with the prosecutor several times and barely even mentioned the defendant's name. The jury, having been given little reason not to, returned with a death sentence. Now, Bookman says that this is more the rule than the exception, that this happens all the time. In addition to poverty, race factors in death penalty applications, as I mentioned. 25 years ago in McCluskey v. Kemp, the Supreme Court acknowledged statistics indicating that defendants charged with killing white victims were 4.3 times more likely to receive a death sentence than defendants charged with killing black victims. They acknowledged that. But they ruled, however, that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment could not be applied to the defendant unless he showed that he was personally discriminated against, which is very difficult. A pattern of racial disparities was unpersuasive. I'm pretty persuaded by that. Right here in Pennsylvania, the Senate voted to review capital cases, in part because the role of gender and race plays a part. University of Maryland in 2003 had a study that demonstrated that blacks who kill whites are 2.5 times more likely to face the death penalty than whites who kill whites, and 3.5 times more likely than blacks who kill blacks. Across the country, 12.5% of the population is African American, but they make up 35% of those presently executed since 1976. Director of Witness to Innocence, David Love, argues, quote, executions in the U.S. are part of a racially coded system of retribution. Poor people and members of racial minorities are more likely to receive the death sentence. Now, on August 26th, I'm going to lead a book discussion here on Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. I urge you to get the book and read it. She traces the impact of race on criminal justice in the United States from the Civil War till today. And capital punishment is just a small piece of it, but reading that book made me even more open to a fairly contentious claim by David Love, who says, perhaps it's no accident that the former Confederate states, with their history of dehumanization through slavery and segregation, and the meting out of mob justice through lynching, are among more enthusiastic practitioners of death. Ouch. But what do you do with the sad reality that statistics show that if you happen to live in the South, and you happen to be a black man, you're more likely to be put to death? Because as a historian, I've always been really moved by the perplexing and powerful role of racial discrimination. When the blood of the Civil War proved insufficient to end racism, the United States passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Their reinforcement of human, civil, and political rights, however, was also insufficient. is only a small step in a road that we're still taking. Because Jim Crow, lynchings, and segregation of all types, and generally apathetic mainstream public has made progress very slow. When I taught high school, I tried to be honest about our country's history. I taught with great pride about the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. I taught with great pride about the civil rights movement, but I didn't hide the hatred and the violence of our system either. I didn't hide the reality of the hangman's noose. Now, there was one very specific image of a noose that posed a problem for Asia Beach. Many of you know Asia. She works with Pennsylvanians for alternatives to the death penalty. And she became involved in prison reform. She's a mother and an artist, but was brought into this area because her brother was wrongfully jailed. And this made her reflect on both the general problems of our criminal justice system, but also the very specific problem of the murder of her cousin. It became clear to Asia that equal justice was elusive and that all systems that provide services for inmates and for victims of murders were insufficient. So she began to combine art and activism. And as she did this, she got involved with this program, Execute Art, Not People. And at the 2010 art show there, her son asked her a question that led her to write a poem very simply called, "My Son Asked Me About a Picture of a Noose." It poses a question that I think all of us would have difficulty answering, especially to a young child. Here it is. How could I forget those nooses or those necks and all those lives hanging? And my 7-year-old son so sweetly asking, "Mommy, what is that?" And pointing to a noose on a wall of nooses, 8 by 10 feet, as wide and long as the cells the condemned pace for each noose pictured. How many lives? 1 life, or 5 lives, or 100 lives, or 1,000 lives? And to say to him out loud what it was, and where it went, and what it did. How many times will we have to explain our barbaric lives to our children? How many necks? How many nooses? It's one thing to explain to a child that human beings sometimes do bad things. That anger and fury can explode in destructive rage. Children can understand that. They feel it. But it's much harder to explain to a child the cold-blooded nature of our contemporary capital punishment system. And this leads me to a link actually to my existentialism talk from last week. Because you see, in researching for this, I found out that Albert Camus, the great existentialist, was an outspoken critic of capital punishment. He remembers his father retelling with disgust and revulsion, witnessing executions. Now this may be in part because in Algeria, where they lived, the preferred method was the guillotine. But it impressed upon Camus a deep revulsion to this. Albert reacted viscerally when anybody mentioned the death penalty, and it became a part of his writing. In The Stranger, one of the dominant themes is the grim rationality of the system moving the protagonist towards his death, or as Camus calls it, legalized murder. Camus did not focus on the ineffectiveness as a deterrent. He didn't focus on any abstract principle like the sacredness of life. As one writer explained, he views the death penalty as an egregious barbarism, an act of blood riot and vengeance covered with a thin veneer of law and civility to make it palpable to our modern sensibilities. That it is also an act of vengeance aimed primarily at the poor and the oppressed, and it is given religious sanction, makes it even more hideous and indefensible in his view. I also think it's indefensible because of my existential perspective, because I view the human conscious experience as sacred and marvelous and awe-inspiring. Making a sense of our conscious experience within a mortal life to me is the fundamental human challenge. And to have our own death taken away from us by the state, to me, violates our integrity and our humanity. I find it an existential violation. Another writer, our own Kate Esposito, touches on this Many years ago, she wrote a powerful piece called Let Singing Dogs Die, the Execution Play. And in it, she cites Camus' reflection on a guillotine. Camus says, confronted with an inescapable death, a man, no matter what his convictions, is devastated throughout the system. The sense of powerlessness and coalition which has willed his death is in itself an unimaginable punishment. The people in this play are devastated throughout the system. To a large part, the coalition that willed his death is you and me. It's everybody who allows the death penalty to exist. Our taxes pay for the poison gas, for the electricity or the lethal cocktail that's injected into the bloodstream of the condemned. And done as it is, in the coldest manner, I find particularly chilling. I find it's the banality of evil that scares me. Now, for years, I've used this following argument against the death penalty, and I think it works. And apologies to legal scholars, I know I'm oversimplifying. But the law distinguishes three types of murder. The most heinous and condemnable is first-degree murder, then second-degree murder, then third-degree murder, which is also called manslaughter. Third-degree murder is unpremeditated and unplanned. You can be guilty of manslaughter if you hit somebody while distracted on your cell phone while you're driving. You didn't plan to do it, you didn't mean to, but you did it. It's bad. But it's not as morally condemnable as second-degree murder, which is unpremeditated but intentional. And a typical example of this is perhaps a lover who discovers their lover with another person and in rage kills. Didn't plan it, but did mean it. It's worse than manslaughter. First-degree murder, which is the most condemnable form, is both premeditated and intentional. You meant to do it and you planned to do it. If these distinctions, if these legal distinctions reflect our moral intuitions, and I think they do, what is more premeditated and planned than state-sanctioned killing? It's an entire legal system that's planned from arrest through sentencing, through execution, to every last detail, including how you dispose of the body. And it's that cold-blooded nature that repels me. It repelled Camus. He said, capital punishment is the most premeditated of murders, to which no criminal's deed, however calculated, can be compared. For there to be an equivalency, the death penalty would have to punish a criminal who had warned his victim of the date on which he would inflict a horrible death, and on him, and who, from that moment onward, had confined him at his mercy for months and months. Such a monster is not to be encountered in private life. I don't want to be a murderer. I don't want to be a monster. I don't want to be an accessory to state executions, but I am. Despite his conversion to opposing capital punishment, so was Supreme Court Justice Blackmun. He explains this in sort of an ironic selection from his dissenting opinion. He said, Bruce Edward Callens will be executed tomorrow by the state of Texas. Intravenous tubes attached to his arms will carry the instrument of death, a toxic fluid designed specifically for the purpose of killing human beings. The witnesses will behold Callens strapped to a gurney, seconds away from execution. He continues, within days or perhaps hours, the memory of Callens will begin to fade, the wheels of justice will begin to grind again, and somewhere another jury or another judge will have the task of determining whether a human being lives or dies. He ends, from this day forward, I will no longer tinker with the machinery of death. I'm saddened by one of the strongest supporters of capital punishment in how they responded to this specific opinion by Blackmun. It reveals the desire for vengeance that animates so many arguments in favor of state-sanctioned killing. In the words of Justice Antonin Scalia, Justice Blackmun begins his statement by describing with poignancy the death of a convicted murderer by lethal injection. He chooses one of the less brutal murders that regularly come before us, the murder of a man ripped by a bullet suddenly and unexpectedly, with no opportunity to prepare himself or his affairs, and left to bleed to death on the floor of a tavern. The death by injection, which Justice Blackmun describes, looks pretty desirable next to that. It looks even better next to some of the other cases currently before us, that what Justice Blackmun did not select as the vehicle for his announcement that the death penalty is always unconstitutional. For example, the case of an 11-year-old girl raped by 4 men and then killed by stuffing her panties down her throat. How enviable a quiet death by lethal injection is compared to that. Now, as many who support the death penalty do, Phila uses ugliness and evil to promote ugliness and evil. Of course, the death of innocent victims is a horrible thing. And the examples he picks are picked to make our blood boil, and they do mine. But to describe the execution of those found guilty of those horrible crimes with terms like pretty desirable and enviable, I think lacks integrity. I think it appeals to the very anger and hatred and thirst for revenge that we can find in this. Of course, we can all fall prey to that. But let's not fan those flames. Let's moderate them with dedication to ethical principles, rationality, and compassion. I don't blame the murder families from feeling angry and hating, perhaps. I think I could be broken by suffering. I might be outraged and taken over by rage and want to see the guilty suffer and die. I might become a part of the mob that Kate mentions in her play. She quotes Clarence Darrow, the great defendant's attorney, in 1928. He said, "The mob is an all-powerful and demands blood for blood. That intangible body of people called the public vents its hatred upon the criminal and enjoys the sensation of having him put to death by the state." Any one of us could become part of a mob. We are all part of the public. I'd like to take a different path. I'd like to take the path that Martin Luther King Jr. did when he said, "I mourn for the loss of thousands of precious lives, but I will not rejoice in the death of one, not even an enemy. Returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that." If I were a theist, I might speak like King when he says, "I don't think God approves the death penalty for any crime, rape, or murder. Capital punishment is against the better judgment of modern criminology, and above all, against the highest expression of love in the nature of God." Coretta Scott King, who lost her husband and her mother-in-law to assassination, understood this well. She said, "I stand firmly and unequivocally opposed to the death penalty for all. An evil deed is not redeemed by an evil deed. Justice is never advanced in the taking of a human life. Morality is never upheld by legalized murder." I admire deeply those who are wounded by violence and hate but rise above violence and hate. As I said, I don't know if I could do that. I admire Asia Beach and many family members of victims who oppose capital punishment. Just last month, in the state where I was born, Connecticut, they abolished the capital punishment. And this happened in no small measure due to the families of victims who testified before the assembly and changed the mind of many people. One was Victoria, whose 18-year-old son Tyler was gunned down 5 years ago in Edgewood Park, where I played as a kid. She said she was tired of a system dedicated more to punishing murderers than to help healing and help the victims. We're here to tell our lawmakers in Connecticut that the death penalty is literally a crime on top of a crime. One state senator who has changed his mind said, "For me, the most compelling reason to reject the death penalty is to set ourselves on the path to the kind of society we really want for our future. I want something better for our future. We cannot confront darkness with darkness and expect light." A Republican representative added, "I don't want the state to be in the business of taking anybody's life, no matter how horrendous the crime." Many of the legislators had their minds changed by the 200 families of victims that testified. They all said, they signed a statement saying that they all felt that countering murder with state-sanctioned killing would, quote, "prolong and deepen their anguish." They changed Connecticut. Can we change Pennsylvania? To conclude, I want to let you know that the American Ethical Union and Ethical Culture has a long history of opposing capital punishment. The American Ethical Union formally called for an end to capital punishment in 1960, 1973, 1979, and 2000. In The Essentials of Spirituality, the founder of ethical culture, Felix Adler, said, "The death penalty as punishment for even the worst of crimes is morally untenable. For either the culprit is really irredeemable, that is to say, he is an irresponsible moral idiot, in which case an asylum for the insane is the proper place for him, or he is not irredeemable, in which case the chance of reforming him should not be taken away from him by cutting off his life." Ethical culture leader Jerome Nathanson served for years as chair of the New York State Committee Against Capital Punishment, and Jared Sackheim this morning gave me a talk of Nathanson's from 1961. And I want to pull this one quote out that ended his talk. He said, "I said at the outset that the first step in trying to reach criminal justice was to recognize the humanity of the criminal too, and to stop trying to read him out of the human race. I think this is the first step, and I think maybe in the long run, it may well be the last step." Ethical humanism urges us to bring out the best in other people. It doesn't say just bring out the best in people who are morally pure or good. Everybody. It demands of us a faith that is deeper than the pain that murder can inflict. It asks for a strength that is greater than the anger that fuels revenge. I'm not naive. I know that we will not always bring out the best of some of the criminals who create these awful situations, but I'm idealistic enough to think that it won't bring out the worst in me. I'm responsible for that. I believe that ethical humanism's quest for social justice includes abolition of the death penalty. It's not easy. Changing society for the better requires tremendous amounts of work. It also demands love. Adler said, "Only the highest motive of all can furnish the power needed to accomplish the miracle of social transformation. Only that conflict was waged for the purpose not of striking down the oppressor and rescuing his victim, but for rescue of both the victim and the oppressor will attain its end." Capital punishment is expensive, ineffective as a deterrent, racially biased, arbitrary, cruel, and a violation of ethical humanism. We need to end capital punishment now and forever. Thank you.